Picture this. It is July 2nd, 1991. You are standing in the sweltering summer heat at the Riverport Amphitheater in St. Louis.
Oh, man, yeah. That is right at the peak of their fame.
Exactly. On stage is Guns N' Roses. And they are arguably the biggest and most dangerous band on the planet at this exact moment.
Oh, absolutely. The energy in those crowds was just, completely volatile.
Right. So the crowd is surging. It is completely unhinged. And then right in the middle of the song Rocket Queen, frontman Axl Rose spots a fan in the front row.
Uh-oh. Let me guess. Recording the show.
Yeah. Illegally recording the concert with a video camera.
Which, in a normal arena show, a singer might just, point to security, right? Have the guy's camera confiscated, just get him escorted out.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But this is not a typical band, and that is definitely not what happened.
No, definitely not.
Frustrated that the venue security isn't doing anything, Axl literally dives headfirst off the stage, right into the crush of the crowd.
Just completely launching himself.
Right, to tackle the spectator himself. He physically wrestles the camera away, climbs back up onto the stage, and then slams his microphone down onto the floor with this massive crash.
And then just walks off, right?
Yeah, he declares, well, thanks to the lame-ass security, I'm going home. And he storms off. The band follows, and the crowd just absolutely loses its mind.
And we are not just talking about a disgruntled crowd booing here. It was a full-blown, terrifying riot. Like that single impulsive decision to dive into the audience left 60 people injured, and it caused over $300,000 in property damage to the venue.
$300,000? That is insane.
Yeah, they destroyed the massive stage setup. They physically ripped the seats out of the concrete. It was absolute pandemonium.
You are listening to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking. Today we are taking a deep dive into a massive stack of comprehensive research reports, historical dossiers, and detailed musicological analyses, all focused on the phenomenon that is Guns N' Roses.
It is a massive stack of sources, too.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive, we want to unpack exactly how this volatile, street-level band managed to completely dismantle the sanitized, hairspray-drenched pop metal scene of the 1980s.
Right, and how they kind of bridged the gap to the grunge movement later on.
Exactly. We're going to explore how they built a sonic architecture that still resonates decades later.
And, it is really crucial to ground ourselves here before we start looking at the music itself, because when you hear stories like the St. Louis Riot, it is incredibly easy to write them off.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Just pure, unadulterated, chaotic attitude.
Right. Just dangerous guys making noise. But as the source material reveals, they were not just reckless punks who got lucky.
Not at all.
They were a highly calculated, incredibly sophisticated musical force. The chaos was real, but the architecture beneath it was brilliant.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why people were literally tearing seats out of concrete in 1991, we really have to understand how they built that incendiary sound in the first place.
We have to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, let's rewind to the mid-1980s in Los Angeles, specifically the Sunset Strip. The scene was absolutely dominated by glam metal.
It was all about the look, right? The hair, the spandex.
Exactly. And sonically, it was heavily processed.
Highly processed. The prevailing production philosophy of that era was total isolation. You would record every instrument separately in this, sterile environment.
Right, no one playing together in the same room.
Exactly. And then they would coat everything in digital reverb and use synthetic drum triggers. It sounded massive on the radio, but it was entirely artificial.
It lacked a human heartbeat.
Yeah, completely. And then, in January 1987, Guns N' Roses enters Rumbo Recorders with producer Mike Klink to track their debut album, Appetite for Destruction.
And Klink recognized instantly that standard 80s production would completely destroy the band's feral energy.
He knew they had to do it differently.
So Klink throws out the glam metal playbook. To capture their live chemistry, he forces them into these grueling 18-hour days.
Which is just exhausting to even think about.
Seriously. They track the entire rhythm section live, playing together in the same room, straight to analog tape. They got those core tracks done in just 2 weeks.
That is incredibly fast for a major label debut.
It really is. And then when it came time to mix, engineers Steve Thompson and Michael Barbiero worked on a Trident 80B console. And here is where it gets fascinating.
Oh, the mixing process, yeah.
That console had absolutely no digital automation. They had to mix the entire thing manually.
Exactly. They were literally writing the faders by hand real time as the song played.
Let me use an analogy here because I think it helps visualize this for you listening. If we think about how music was being made then with all that digital programming, it's a difference between hand building a custom muscle car versus 3D printing a plastic replica.
Ooh, I like that.
And to take it a step further, digital mixing automation is like setting your car to cruise control. It's mathematically perfect, but it's sterile.
Right, doesn't breathe.
Exactly. Writing the faders by hand means the engineers are physically driving the song. They are manually accelerating the volume, going into the heavy chorus, and then, hitting the brakes in the quieter verses.
You can literally feel a human reacting to the music in real time. It gives the album a living, breathing, dynamic pocket that you just could not fake with a computer.
That's so visceral.
It is. But and this is where their strategic brilliance really comes in, it wasn't entirely a raw lo-fi punk record either. They were incredibly smart about their commercial appeal.
What do you mean?
Well, While they rejected the synthetic drum triggers of their peers, Klink and the mixers deliberately added just a touch of digital reverb specifically to Steven Adler's snare drum.
Wait, hold on. I thought Klink's whole goal was to completely avoid that artificial 80s sound.
It was.
So doesn't adding digital reverb to the snare drum completely contradict that entire philosophy?
It sounds like a contradiction for sure, but it was actually a highly calculated masterstroke. That one move simulated a massive physical arena space.
Oh.
Yeah, it bridged the gap between their street-level grit and commercial rock radio viability. It allowed the snare to punch right out of the speakers and sound huge on the radio without losing the analog dirt of the guitars.
And that makes a lot of sense. But that massive arena snare drum wouldn't have worked if the guitar sounded muddy, right?
Not at all. They would have just clashed.
So to keep the sound huge but clear, they had to divide the guitar work in a highly unusual way. It wasn't just Slash standing there shredding over everything.
Right.
It was this push and pull, this duality between two very different players that really acted as the engine of the band.
Absolutely. If we break down the sonic architecture, you have Slash on lead guitar. His setup was meticulous.
Very specific gear, right?
Yeah, he used a 1959 Gibson Les Paul replica, and he plugged it into a modified Marshall 1959T Super Tremolo amplifier.
And the sources refer to that amp as stock number 39, I think?
Yes, stock number 39. But what made Slash's tone so distinctive was how he manipulated the equalization.
Okay, how so?
Well, instead of scooping out the mid-range frequencies, which was the standard heavy metal practice at the time to get that aggressive hollow crunch, Slash actually boosted his mid-range.
And why does boosting the mid-range matter so much?
Because the mid-range is exactly where the human voice sits. By boosting those frequencies, he created a warm, high-gain, vocal-like blues growl with almost endless sustain.
So his guitar literally sounded like it was singing.
Precisely.
And then you contrast that beautifully singing heavy tone with Izzy Stradlin on rhythm guitar. Izzy completely rejected the heavy metal solid body guitars.
He went in a totally different direction.
He really did. He played a hollow body Gibson ES-175D through a Fender Bassman amplifier.
Which is fascinating because, I mean, why use a hollow jazz guitar in a loud hard rock band?
Exactly. You would think it would just feed back uncontrollably and sound super weak next to Slash.
But because the guitar is hollow, the notes decay much faster. They don't sustain and ring out forever like Slash's solid body Les Paul does.
Ah, so it leaves space.
Right. It allowed Izzy to play highly rhythmic, dry, percussive chops. It was a semi-clean roots rock crunch that didn't bleed into Slash's long, wailing notes.
And from a music theory standpoint, the sources highlight how the band heavily utilized the Mixolydian mode.
Yes, very bluesy.
And they used this specific double pligal chord progression, the flat 7, 4, 1.
Which is a staple of their sound.
Right. And for anyone listening without a music degree, what that basically means is that they avoided the need to predictable resolutions of standard pop music.
It never quite settles.
Exactly. That specific chord progression keeps you slightly on edge. It creates this rolling momentum without ever feeling fully resolved, which is exactly what gives a song like Sweet Child of Mine its undeniable swagger.
And underneath those guitars, you have Duff McKagan providing these highly melodic, punk-influenced bass lines.
Using a Fender Jazz Special bass, right?
Yep, and he ran it through a Uray LA2A compressor.
And for you listening, a compressor basically squashes the audio signal. It takes the quietest parts and the loudest parts and evens them out.
It makes it punchy.
Exactly. So Duff's bass wasn't just rumbling softly in the background. The compressor gave it a gritty, aggressive attack that hit you like a wall, constantly pushing the song forward.
Combine that with drummer Steven Adler's loose, funk-influenced swing, and you have a rhythm section that isn't just keeping metronomic time. I mean, it is actively grooving.
Let me ask you this, because I want to make sure I'm visualizing the stereo image correctly based on the research.
Sure, go ahead.
If you are listening to this on headphones right now, are you hearing Slash in the center of the mix, almost acting like a secondary vocalist with that thick mid-range tone, while Izzy is out on the left and right flanks driving the car?
That is precisely it. And the Track Night Train is the perfect example of this seamless three-dimensional guitar interplay.
Oh yeah, such a great track.
Izzy plays the first 8 bars of the initial guitar solo with this clean, melodic, rolling feel, and then he transitions seamlessly into Slash's searing, high-gain continuation.
It's just brilliant arranged.
It is. Slash holds the center stage, while Izzy, Duff, and Steven Adler create this incredibly wide, swinging foundation beneath him.
So the guitars built this massive swinging foundation.
Yeah.
But, you know, an instrumental track doesn't cause a riot.
No, definitely not.
It was Axl Rose's vocals and his lyrics that injected the dangerous, unvarnished truth of the LA underbelly into the culture.
Musically, Axl's vocal capabilities were staggering. We are talking about a functional 3-octave range.
3 octaves, that's huge.
Yeah, from C3 all the way up to C6.
Meaning he could hit the low, rumbling notes of a baritone singer and then instantly snap up to notes so incredibly high they actually compete with the lead guitar solo for your ear's attention.
Exactly. And he achieved his signature sound by using a technique called glottal compression.
Okay, break that down for us.
Think of it like pinching the neck of a balloon before you let the air out to get that high, tearing screech.
Oh, that makes sense.
He squeezed his vocal cords tightly together before pushing air through them. That is what gave him that vicious rasp, combined with nasal resonance to give the notes incredible brightness and projection over those really loud guitars.
And he used that voice to deliver what the researchers call social realism.
Yes, the lyrics.
Because the glam bands were selling the vanity of the Sunset Strip. Partying girls, endless good times.
The glamorous side.
But Guns N' Roses were selling the reality of the alleyways behind the Sunset Strip. Axl was writing songs like Mr. Brownstone, which is just a brutally candid look at the daily grinding reality of heroin addiction.
And Welcome to the Jungle, which documented the predatory, violent nature of urban decay.
There was zero romanticism. They traded escapism for journalism.
That is a crucial insight. They blew up because they felt real in a manufactured era.
But there's a flip side to that, right?
There is. That commitment to unfiltered social realism frequently crossed the line into severe cultural volatility. Looking at the historical record, there is a highly controversial moment in 1988 when the band released One in a Million, and the lyrics contain highly offensive slurs targeting Black people, gay people, and immigrants.
And we need to pause here and be very clear. For you listening, we are strictly impartial on this deep dive.
Very important to state.
We are just reporting what is documented in the historical dossiers. We are absolutely not endorsing any of these viewpoints. We are just analyzing the historical record.
Exactly. And historically, the backlash to this song was immediate and intense.
Oh, I bet.
Axl Rose defended the lyrics in the press, claiming they were not representative of systemic bigotry, but rather the raw, naive thoughts of a vulnerable protagonist.
So he was trying to distance himself from the narrator of the song.
Yeah, he framed it as a character study of a scared kid from Indiana arriving at a bus station in Los Angeles and just feeling threatened by a world he didn't understand.
But that defense triggered a massive ideological clash within the music industry.
It really did. The most notable flashpoint occurred in October 1989 when Guns N' Roses opened for the Rolling Stones at the LA Coliseum.
Huge show.
Huge. And sharing the bill was the all-black rock band Living Colour, who operated on a progressive, politically conscious model of art.
Right.
So after Axl went on a stage rant defending his use of the slurs, Living Colour's guitarist Vernon Reid delivered a direct rebuttal from the stage the very next night.
Wow. In front of that same massive crowd.
Yes. He told the crowd that if you don't have a problem with Black or gay people, you shouldn't use slurs to degrade them.
That was a very direct response.
It was, and the massive crowd erupted in cheers, which publicly exposed the limits of Axl's defense.
So what does this all mean for their legacy? It shows the razor-thin line between authentic documentarian and destructive provocation.
Definitely.
I mean, you can capture the grit of the street, but when you rely on the language of prejudice to do it, you stop being an observer and start becoming the threat yourself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this level of massive success, combined with constant controversy, substance abuse, and internal volatility, it was entirely unsustainable.
It was a powder keg.
Exactly. Something had to give, and what gave was their sonic identity. The friction forced a radical shift that ultimately fractured the classic lineup.
The transition from the late 80s to the early 90s for this band is mind-blowing to me.
It's like two different bands.
Truly. We mentioned earlier that their Raw debut album, Appetite for Destruction, was recorded for roughly $370,000.
Which is, a decent budget, but not crazy.
Right. But fast forward to 1991, and they are recording the Use Your Illusion double albums. Suddenly we are looking at multi-million-dollar budget bloat.
The scale just exploded.
The sound completely mutates. They move away from the tight blues punk alleyways and into symphonic progressive art rock.
We are talking grand pianos, synthesizers, and programmed strings on 9-minute epics like November Rain.
And that level of grandiosity required a different kind of machinery, which resulted in major personnel casualties.
It did. In July 1990, drummer Steven Adler was fired.
Because of his addiction, right?
Yeah. His severe heroin addiction made it impossible for him to execute the complex, progressive drum arrangements required for the new material.
That is so sad.
It is. He was replaced by Matt Sorum from the band The Cult. Now, Sorum was a powerhouse, but his style was a rigid metronomic drive.
Oh, so that groove we talked about already.
Gone. That loose, dangerous swing that defined their early groove, that push and pull with the bass, was instantly gone.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's the ultimate rock paradox.
How so?
Well, the Hungry Street Band, literally fighting for scraps, gets rich, gets famous, and suddenly they don't want to play the raw punk blues that got them out of the gutter.
Right, they want to be a grand orchestra.
Exactly. They want to write 10-minute orchestral epics with backing choirs.
And that paradox tore the band apart from the inside. Slash and Duff McKagan vehemently opposed this symphonic drift.
They hated it.
They felt that layering synthesizers and piano ballads over everything was destroying their core identity as a dangerous, guitar-driven hard rock band.
I can see their point.
And the tension became unbearable for Izzy Stradlin. He was the band's primary songwriting backbone, and having recently gotten sober himself, the ballooning egos, the late starts, and the sheer scale of the production alienated him completely.
So what did he do?
In November 1991, Izzy quit the band.
Wow. But, even as they were fracturing internally, they inadvertently paved the way for an entirely new generation of rock music.
They really did set the stage.
By the time they were self-destructing, they had already acted as the crucial bridge to the grunge movement.
The sources actually quote Soundgarden's Chris Cornell specifically on this point.
Oh, really? What did he say?
Cornell credited Guns N' Roses with jump-starting the grittier alternative rock trend of the late 80s.
That makes total sense.
By stripping away the synthesizer loops and the matching spandex of the glam era, Guns N' Roses proved to major record labels that raw, emotionally abrasive, dangerous rock could achieve massive commercial success.
They proved it was viable.
They essentially kicked the door open, allowing heavier, less produced bands like Soundgarden and Nirvana to thrive in the mainstream.
So they trained your ears for the 90s alternative revolution without you even realizing it. They detoxed the culture from plastic pop metal.
Exactly.
But while grunge was taking over the world, Axl Rose was taking Guns N' Roses into a completely different, almost cybernetic future.
Oh, here we go.
Following the departure of the classic lineup, Axl embarked on a 14-year, $13 million obsession, and that eventually became the 2008 album Chinese Democracy.
And why did it take 14 years and $13 million?
Well, because it was a complete industrial electrometamorphosis, and Axl was chasing absolute perfection in a genre he was really just discovering.
He shifted sounds entirely again.
Yeah, he became fascinated by the production techniques of Nine Inch Nails. He brought in avant-garde guitarists, he utilized heavy digital loops, trip-hop rhythms, and ambient noise.
Just a totally different landscape.
It was a dense, highly processed wall of sound that divided rock purists, but really showcased his relentless desire to push the boundaries of modern synthesis.
And that adaptability, that refusal to just be a nostalgia act, continues right up to the present day.
Oh, definitely.
You have the massive reunion tour that kicked off in 2016, bringing Axl, Slash, and Duff back together for one of the highest grossing tours in history.
Which nobody thought would ever happen.
Right. But they didn't stop there. In January 2024, they released a music video for the song The General.
Oh, I saw that.
It heavily utilized AI-generated psychedelic animation. So from analog tape in 1987 to artificial intelligence in 2024, they are still pushing into the digital future.
If we synthesize all of this, the deep dive reveals that Guns N' Roses was never just one thing.
No, they were constantly evolving.
They were a unique, fleeting convergence of undeniable musical chemistry, brilliant structural composition, and utter uncompromising chaos.
They systematically dismantled an era of manufactured rock and replaced it with something dangerously real.
Yes.
Their architecture was always shifting, from the manual fader writing on their debut to the symphonic bloat of the 90s, but their impact on how rock music sounds and feels is permanent.
We spent a lot of time today talking about how their internal volatility fueled their authenticity, how the very real danger made the music undeniably powerful.
It is what made them who they were.
But it makes you wonder for yourself, is it actually possible to create world-shifting, generation-defining art without destroying yourself in the process?
That is the big question, isn't it?
Or is the chaos a mandatory ingredient for the genius? If you like this episode, please support the show by liking and subscribing.